Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are setting off on an absolutely incredible journey through historical theology. We're going to explore exactly how the borders of the Christian church were drawn, erased, and then completely redrawn over a millennium. It's a massive story, full of unity, fracture, power, and deep faith. And it literally shapes the institutions we see all around us today. So, I want to start us off with a seemingly simple question. What exactly makes a church, well, a church? Sounds pretty elementary, right? But believe it or not, historical theologians fought fiercely, like for over 1,000 years, just to define the exact boundaries of who is in and who is out. And the answer to this single question completely changed the course of history. Okay, let's dive into this massive timeline we're tracking today. We're going to start all the way back in the year 250 with early church leaders, move right through the heavy medieval papal decrees, and finally arrive at the explosive theological fractures of the 16th century Reformation. Here's our quick roadmap for covering these 1,300 years. First, defining the early church. Second, Augustine's enduring influence. Third, the peak of papal power. Fourth, sparks of the Reformation. And finally, number 5, the Protestant confessions. Let's get right to it. Section 1, defining the early church, focusing on unity and survival. Now, to really grasp early doctrines about the church, you gotta realize they weren't just dreamt up in some peaceful, quiet study. No way. They were forged in the absolute crisis of Roman persecution. Cyprian of Carthage, a really prominent bishop back in the 3rd century, penned this famous line. See, with believers literally facing torture and some even abandoning the faith under the immense pressure, Cyprian had to figure out a way to hold everyone together. So he drew incredibly strict boundaries. He emphasized that belonging to the visible church was absolutely vital for salvation. For him, your individual belief was inextricably tied to the organized body of believers. Building directly on that need for definition, the Constantinopolitan Creed of 381 established 4 baseline attributes. They said the church is 1, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. These 4 pillars became the definitive, lasting vocabulary for what constituted the true people of God. Regardless of all the wild debates that came later, both Catholics and Protestants would always look back to these 4 foundational words. But hey, we really need to clarify a critical piece of jargon from that creed. When the early church used the word Catholic, they weren't talking about the Roman Catholic institution like we might think of it today. In early church vocabulary, Catholic simply meant universal. It was just describing the universality of the church, the idea that it was spread out like a net across the entire earth, basically wherever believers happened to be gathered. Moving right along to Section 2, Augustine's enduring influence, specifically the idea of the mixed body. Stepping forward chronologically, we arrive at the towering figure of St. Augustine. And honestly, his foundational ideas on the nature of the church were so profound that centuries later, both Catholic theologians and Protestant reformers would build their theology directly upon his work. What's really interesting here is how incredibly realistic his view was of the people actually sitting in the pews. He taught that the visible church is a mixed company. Basically, it's messy. In this earthly life, the church is a mix of genuine believers and, well, hypocrites. Augustine argued that while the outward, visible church is mixed, the only true members are a hidden, fixed number of the elect known only to God. Now, Augustine actually developed this nuanced, mixed company view to push back against a schismatic group called the Donatists. The Donatists demanded a perfectly pure church. They claimed that if a priest had lapsed or caved during Roman persecution, any sacrament he performed later, like, say, a baptism, was completely void. Can you imagine the sheer spiritual anxiety that caused for everyday believers? So Augustine pushed back hard against this demand for human perfection. He argued that the validity of the gospel and the sacraments doesn't depend on the flawed, messy humans administering them. It depends entirely on Christ. Section 3, the peak of papal power and unum sanctum. Stepping significantly forward in time, to the year 1302, we see a massive shift. The borders of the church became rigidly tied not just to a universal faith, but to raw, earthly, institutional power. Pope Boniface VIII issued a highly defining document called Unum Sanctum. In it, he declared that the Roman institution possessed 2 swords, the spiritual and the temporal. What did that mean? Well, it meant the papal hierarchy was claiming absolute, exclusive authority, not just over the spiritual souls of Christendom, but over all earthly governments and physical powers too. The definition of the church was now centered entirely around subjection to the Roman pontiff. Let's move to Section 4 and see how this builds. Sparks of the Reformation and the Hidden Remnant. So, as you might guess, when an institution claims absolute earthly power, deep moral decay often follows right behind it. And that decay sparked an incredible wave of pushback from thinkers we now call the pre-reformers. You have this extreme tension building up. On one hand, Boniface VIII drew the borders of the church super tightly around a highly visible physical hierarchy in papal succession. But on the other hand, pre-reformers like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus looked at all that corruption and basically inverted the borders. They turned them inward. They defined the church invisibly, leaning entirely on God's sovereignty. To them, the true church was just the hidden assembly of those predestined to salvation, completely bypassing the outward institutional mess. John Hus actually took this idea to an incredible level. He argued that it doesn't take massive, ornate cathedrals or powerful bishops to make a church. Literally just two righteous persons gathered together in Christ's name constitute a holy church. Think about how radical a redefinition that was for the 15th century. It completely stripped away the absolute necessity of the massive institution, handing the definition of the church right back to a tiny faithful remnant. Which brings us to Section 5, the Protestant Confessions, where they start redrawing the lines. All this tension finally exploded into the climax of our explainer, the Reformation. As the church fractured, brand new theological documents had to be drafted to formally teach these changing definitions. But the reformers faced a really huge dilemma. If the true church isn't guaranteed by the Pope, how on earth do you visually identify it? While the Augsburg Confession of 1530 solved this puzzle by establishing two very specific marks. First, is the gospel preached in its purity? And second, are the holy sacraments properly administered? These theological practices, not a historical, unbroken hierarchy, became the new borderlines. As the ideas of the Reformation spread like wildfire across Europe, we run into a traditional Scottish word, kirk. It simply means church. Just keep that translation in your back pocket as we dive into the fierce, totally unapologetic theology of the Scottish Reformers next. The Scots Confession of 1560 is a seriously heavy-hitting theological document. The Scots placed a deeply Trinitarian emphasis on their definition of the church. They also made this fascinating covenantal claim that there has been one continuous kirk stretching all the way back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. They firmly held that the true kirk is invisible and known only to God, utterly rejecting any kind of pluralism. And they even expanded their theology of the family, explicitly including the children of faithful parents right within God's covenant. Right around the exact same time, the Belgic Confession of 1561 provided a truly beautiful summary of this whole historical evolution. It pushed back hard against any notion that the church had to be geographically centered in Rome or anywhere else for that matter. It declared that the true church is absolutely not confined or bound to one place. Instead, it's a completely borderless gathering. It's dispersed and spread throughout the entire world, united by heart, will, and faith, no matter how small or insignificant it might visibly appear to the eyes of men. Well, that brings us to the end of our timeline, but honestly, the story isn't quite over. I want to leave you with this provocative thought. How do these 1,300-year-old debates over unity, earthly authority, and who exactly is in or out still echo in our modern institutions today? When you look closely at today's theological debates and institutional conflicts, you can still see the shadows of Cyprian, Augustine, and the reformers standing right behind them. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep asking the big questions.